Hello, I'm Charlie Thompson, and welcome back to Chapter 13, Ecosystems and Soils. So, I thought I should give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about, because a lot of you probably have never run into the term ecosystems before. So, ecosystems are groups of plants and animals, and we will study flows of energy and matter. So we're going all the way back to the very first chapter when we talked about systems being open and closed to energy and matter. Well, now we're actually going to see where the energy and matter is flowing within groups of plants and animals. Those flows of energy and matter usually happen by being eaten. So if you've watched any nature shows, you realize after a while, oh, wait a minute, everybody in this movie's got to eat. So the cute animals, yeah, they're probably going to get eaten. Soil. We'll talk about soil, which is dirt and organic material. Soil's absolutely fascinating. We'll talk about how ecosystems are organized, usually into trophic levels, like producers make food from the sun, consumers eat producers, then there's decomposers that eat dead stuff. So ecosystems are pretty much organized based on either whomst you're eating or who's eating you. Yeah, that's the way ecosystems are organized. So, and we'll look at how ecosystems respond to change. We'll talk about things like evolution. Evolution is one way that ecosystems respond to change. We'll look at invasive species. And we'll look at human disturbances and natural disturbances and how ecosystems respond to change. So we'll look at the living, the biotic, and the non-living, the abiotic components of ecosystems. We'll look at all the different parts and see how they fit together and work. We'll look at soil. Again, that's dirt and organic material all mixed together. It's a living, dynamic, fascinating thing, soil. We'll look at how ecosystems are organized. Again, organized by trophic levels, primary producers, consumers, omnivores, all that good stuff. How do ecosystems respond to change? Usually by changing. So, 13.1, energy flows and nutrient cycles. So, biodiversity refers to the number of different species. Like with almost everything in life, diversity is a good thing. The more diversity there is, the better off an ecosystem is, generally speaking. And biodiversity is a term for the number of different species in a place. Reflects the interaction of living and non-living components of the biosphere over time. The healthier an ecosystem is, the higher I can say that again. The healthier an ecosystem is, the greater the biodiversity would usually be. The biosphere is the layer of living material on Earth. It goes from below the ocean floor to about 8 kilometers into the atmosphere. Biogeography is the study of the distribution of plants and animals over space and time. So that covers things like on the short time period of like annual migrations across grasslands, of things like wildebeest or bison. Also covers organisms migrating more slowly over longer periods of time. An ecosystem, a self-sustaining association of plants and animals and their non-living physical environment. That's a pretty good definition for ecosystem. Ecosystems range in size from a pond to a city park to a large forest or a desert. So they range in size from tiny to large. Some sample ecosystems. We've got a tropical savanna. We've got temperate grassland with bison. We've got Arctic tundra. We've got temperate marsh. So these are just examples of different ecosystems. So when we're talking about energy flows, when we're talking about trophic levels, we're talking about at the building block of the food chain, the first link in the food chain, the foundation of the food pyramid, are primary producers. Those are the ecosystem's plants. They provide food from sunlight. There are consumers. Those are animals that eat the primary producers and then provide food for other consumers. There's decomposers that break down dead material so that those nutrients can be recycled. Ecosystems are open systems. They're open in terms of energy. They're open in terms of matter. And when we're looking at an ecosystem, there's the biotic components. That's the living material, bio-life. Biotic refers to living components. The abiotic components are the environmental factors. Not biotic, living. So abiotic literally means not living. For example, temperature. The temperatures of an ecosystem are part of the abiotic components. The amount of rainfall, the amount of sunlight, all of those are examples of abiotic factors in an ecosystem. So here we've got some biotic components, some abiotic components. We have things like gases and water and mineral cycles that, like oxygen to carbon dioxide, back to oxygen to carbon dioxide, water evaporating and then condensing, precipitating, evaporating, condensing, precipitating. Same thing with minerals. Minerals get recycled. So gases, water, minerals, nutrients, insulation, those are all abiotic components. The biotic components would be producers, primary producers, or primary consumer, an herbivore that just eats plants, a carnivore that just eats meat. And then there's decomposers, fungi, bacteria, other organisms. So the blue lines are the flows of nutrients, and the yellow lines are the flow of heat energy. It says heat, but really I would think of that as just energy in general, but heat's pretty good. So energy from the sun goes to the plants. Energy from the plants goes to the consumers. Once they're dead, their energy gets used by the decomposers. So real quick, and we'll probably hit this a couple times in this chapter, but photosynthesis is magic. Photosynthesis is when plants take in water and carbon dioxide and light and make sugar, C6H12O6, and oxygen. So that's plants taking in water and gas and light and making sugar and oxygen. And then plants can break down that sugar in a process called respiration, where they take sugar and oxygen and they break it down and they get energy that they can use. And the byproducts then are water and carbon dioxide. So photosynthesis and respiration are just mirror images of each other. Respiration is going from sugar and oxygen to water, carbon dioxide, and energy. And photosynthesis is air and water and energy making sugar and oxygen. So the energy in ecosystems, except for the chemosynthetic bacteria at the bottom of the ocean that's breaking down the minerals coming out of the hot smokers at deep ocean vents, everybody else gets their energy from the sun. Photosynthesis is powered by visible light, converts carbon dioxide, water, and light into carbohydrates and oxygen. Plants store the energy as sugar and other carbohydrates for later use, for example, at night. Plants consume carbohydrates through respiration, and then they give off carbon dioxide and water. Respiration, plants break down carbohydrates with oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Hey, it's that C6H12O6 plus O2 gives you H2O plus CO2 plus energy. Carbs made by photosynthesis minus the carbs used up in respiration is called net photosynthesis. So it's the energy that the plants make minus the energy that the plants use is net photosynthesis. So here we got a breakdown of those. Photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, water, and light makes glucose and oxygen. And then at night, or whenever the plants need the energy, they break down glucose and oxygen and they get carbon dioxide, water, and energy. This is an electron microscope view of this, a cross-section of a leaf. Here we've got the chloroplasts. Here we've got stoma, the openings into the leaf that allow gases to enter and exit, a vein to transport nutrients and water. So the chloroplasts are these green structures that contain chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the magic chemical that allows them to do photosynthesis. Stoma are openings that the plants can regulate to let in and out gases. So net primary productivity. So the net photosynthesis for an ecosystem is the net primary productivity. It's the amount of energy captured and stored by an ecosystem. Biomass is the total weight of the organic material in an ecosystem. It's all the organic, so living and formerly living matter in an ecosystem. Net primary productivity is highest between the tropics and decreases with higher latitudes and elevation. So here we've got a video that I put in of net primary productivity, which is atmospheric carbon absorbed by plants. And yeah, I'm going to turn off the closed captions. We don't need those because they're not saying anything. So you can see the little ticker going by. What we're looking at is spring into summer, into fall, winter, back to spring and summer, winter, spring, summer. So you can see, for example, the shifting position of the sun as the plants respond to long days and darkness, back to long days, back to darkness. You can really dramatically see it. It would be nice if they had a latitude and longitude overlay grid, because here's the equator. And I know I keep going on and on about the difference between northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere land masses, but yeah, I'll just start you again. So you can see that the high latitudes, so this would be the mid latitudes and then the subpolar areas, really dramatic change from summer to winter, like nothing in the winter and very dramatic growth in the summertime. So the ITCZ is going to play a role, and day length is going to play a role, and temperature is going to play a role. And here's just a static map showing the highest net primary productivity is indeed in the tropics, in the region dominated by the ITCZ. And then in the deserts, water is an important limiting factor, so not much going on in the deserts. And then in the mid and high latitudes, there's a strong seasonal productivity with, in the summertime, the long days allow them to photosynthesize, and in the wintertime, in the fall, they just go dormant because there's no light and the ground is frozen. So the highest net productivity, the highest net primary productivity on an annual basis is found in the tropics. The highest net primary productivity on a shorter time scale is actually the plain states, because again, they have those super long days in the summertime. They have enough water. They can actually have higher net productivity in the grasslands than in tropical rainforests. Although, like I said, if you average everything out over a year, the tropics are the winner. Biogeochemical cycles. So we'll talk about nutrients. Those are chemicals that are essential for life. Most abundant nutrients in living matter: hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, another important element. The key chemicals move through cycles. They don't just get stuck. If they got stuck, nobody else would be able to use them. And we're going to call these biogeochemical cycles. Bio because life is involved. Geochemical because they're chemicals, and some of those chemicals are coming from the atmosphere. Some of them are coming from the soil. So they're geochemicals, but it's a biogeochemical cycle because life is involved as well. So we've got the oxygen and carbon cycles intertwined through photosynthesis and respiration. Photosynthesis is the main source of atmospheric oxygen. Algae in the ocean doing the bulk of producing oxygen that we breathe, not the rainforests. The rainforests are not the world's lungs. I don't know what they are, but they're not the world's lungs. They pretty much use as much oxygen as they make. Thanks, algae. The atmosphere links carbon-fixing photosynthesis with carbon-releasing respiration. So this is the carbon cycle, and we studied this when we talked about climate change, in that there are sinks like soil and rock and the atmosphere and the ocean, and then there's flux with the carbon going back and forth between, for example, carbon stored in fossil fuels, and then carbon being burned and released into the atmosphere. That carbon is taken up by plants, and then in respiration it's released, and then when those organisms die and they get broken down, that carbon gets released. So we've got carbon cycling. We've got the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen makes up over 78% of the atmosphere. Nitrogen is a key component of organic molecules, very important in making proteins. So the atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, but the only way to get nitrogen into soil out of the atmosphere is either lightning strikes or nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria are incredibly important in fixing the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere and making into a form that's available to organisms in the soil. And when I say organisms, I'm talking about plants. So if it wasn't for nitrogen-fixing bacteria, we probably wouldn't have plants. Everything would be completely different. It's the bacteria in the soil living in nodules on the roots that are fixing bacteria. Especially with the legumes, peas, beans, clover, peanuts, all of those plants fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into the soil where plants can use it. So we've got the nitrogen cycle. I don't really care a whole lot about the nitrogen cycle. If you remember that bacteria are the ones that are important for fixing it, that's good. If you know that 78% of nitrogen, or 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but it doesn't matter because plants can't just pull it out of the air. Oh, I probably should have said that before. Sure, it's great. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. Plants, their leaves are open, the stoma are open to the atmosphere, but the gas nitrogen in the atmosphere, they can't use it. So atmospheric nitrogen chemically fixed by bacteria into the soil where plants can get at it. That's how the nitrogen becomes available for plants. Oh, right. So it's a biogeochemical cycle, right? It's the bacteria that are actually doing the fixing of the nitrogen that was in the atmosphere. Now it's in the soil, but it's there because of the bacteria. Nitrogen is an important fertilizer for plants. Plants need lots of nitrogen. And if there's insufficient natural nitrogen, what farmers for some time since World War I actually have been doing is adding synthetic inorganic fertilizers, which is a losing proposition. Humans fix more nitrogen to synthetic fertilizer than all the nitrogen in terrestrial sources. So farmers put too much nitrogen on their crops. Some of the problems, I'm going to back up for just a second and talk about the synthetic. The synthetic fertilizers have a couple effects on the soil. They make the soil more compact. They reduce organic content in the soil, which reduces the water holding capability of the soil. So by using synthetic fertilizer, the soil health is actually decreased over time. The soil gets worse and worse and worse. In fact, the more synthetic fertilizer you put onto the soil, the worse off the soil is going to be. So organic agriculture, the key to organic agriculture is really feeding the plant, or feeding the soil to feed the plant. They're all about the health of the soil because that's where the plants get their nutrients best. That's the key to having the healthiest soil, would be doing organic agriculture, which tries to mimic natural processes as much as possible. So some of the problems, the nutrients, the fertilizer, right, goes into water and it feeds algae, and the algae goes crazy and they reproduce like crazy. It's called an algae bloom or phytoplankton bloom. Phytoplankton are the little plants in the oceans and water that are photosynthesizing. So all the algae and phytoplankton then die, and then when the decomposers start to eat them, conditions are great for the decomposers, so they start reproducing. So now the algae's dead, and the decomposers, the decomposing microorganisms, are achieving really high population levels because conditions are so good. So they decrease the oxygen level. The algae's gone, so it's not making oxygen. The decomposers are using oxygen. So you get really low oxygen levels in the water as a result of this explosion in algae. This causes what are called dead zones. There's actually so little oxygen that if fish swim into that water in the dead zones, they die because they suffocate. So here's the Mississippi drainage, and here's regions where they have really high fertilizer use, and that all goes into the Gulf of Mexico. And here is showing the extent of dead zones. Yeah, here you can see the dead zone a little bit better across pretty much most of Louisiana. But the offshore coast of most of Louisiana, they have dead zones because of too much fertilizer causing the algae to go crazy. Once the algae is dead, the decomposers go crazy, and then they use up all the oxygen. And then everything else dies that needs oxygen. Soil development, soil profiles. Let's talk about soil. So we've got weathered rock particles and organic material with water and air. That's a good definition. Soil is very complex. Organic material includes living microorganisms and plant roots, dead, partially decomposed plant and animal matter, and fully decomposed plant matter called humus. Humus. This is humus. Hummus is of course, the chickpea dip. It is delicious. Humus. It's an open system. Human activities affect soil development, usually in a bad way. So here we've got the role of microorganisms and macroorganisms. So animals that live in the soil churn it up through burrowing. Earthworms move through the soil. They actually eat soil. They just cruise around eating soil and pooping it out. And when they do that, they create tunnels that act as airspace. There's decomposers. As the plants grow through the soil, they help break it up. As these organisms crawl and migrate through the soil, they also break it up and make it looser. That allows roots to grow more easily. Fungi help bind everything together and add organic matter and help cycle nutrients. So the weathering of rocks provides raw material. So when we're talking about soil and the fertility of soil at the basic level is going to be a function of the parent geology. What were the rocks that got broken up to make the soil? So the chemical composition of the rocks is going to determine how fertile the soil is. Like volcanic soils are excellent for growing crops. Other, like granite in the Sierras, not nearly as fertile. So the chemistry of the geology is going to be the first factor that's going to affect soil. Climate is a major influence. If it's too cold, if it's frozen for most of the year, if it's too dry, there's not enough water. Yeah, it's like Goldilocks. Too much water, no good. Not enough water, no good. Too hot, no good. Too cold, no good. So it's got to be the right mix of enough water with moderate temperatures, so you can have good microorganisms, you can have good plant growth. All of those encourage good soils. Biological activity, microorganisms, macroorganisms. Topography and slopes, steep slopes, everything falls down. So flatter areas generate better soils or grow better soils over time. Time is very important. Soil takes a long time to develop from rock. I was going to say the ballpark is like 500 years for an inch of soil. So here we've got slope, we've got aspect. South-facing slopes are drier, north-facing slopes are wetter. Flat slopes have better soil. A floodplain would have really good soil. Steep slopes are going to have shallow soil. So if the slopes are too steep, you're going to get bad soil or not very fertile soil. Floodplains, really good for soil. Flat areas, good for soil. Slopes that have more moisture are going to develop better soils because they'll have better plant growth, so there's more organic material, so there's more nutrients. Soil building can take 500 years to create a few centimeters, which is another way of saying it can take 500 years to make an inch of topsoil. Poor farming practices result in losing soil faster than it's forming. I want to say since the 1960s, we've probably lost half the soil in the plain states. A problem in dry regions is they become drier. That's called desertification. Overgrazing can, if you graze animals, they eat all the crops, and then there's nothing to hold the soil and it gets washed away. Same thing with deforestation. When you cut down the trees, the nutrients are often in the trees, so now you've just taken the nutrients and put them someplace else, and then now there's nothing to protect the soil after it's been deforested, so the soil runs away and then you lose soil. Salinization is totally interesting, and that happens in arid areas where you have to irrigate. So if you have to irrigate, there's not enough rainfall, right? That's why you're irrigating. So as they irrigate, they add water and minerals to the soil. The water evaporates, so the minerals get left behind, and eventually what happens is salt builds up in the soil until the soil can become so salty that plants can't grow. No matter how much water, you could have the field completely flooded with water, but that water would be saltier than the water in the plants. So what actually happens is through osmotic pressure, the plants get dehydrated and die. Because the water in the plants are trying to reach the same level of saltiness as the water around them, and they do that by losing water. So salinization is an inevitable consequence of irrigated agriculture in dry areas. In Iran, like 94, 97%, someplace in there of their cultivated land is becoming too salty to grow food. So over time, they're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. It's very, very, very difficult to deal with. The obvious solution is put so much water on it that you flush out the salts and then they run someplace else. But the places where you do irrigated agriculture, there isn't enough water, so it's hard to do. Sustainable practices, reducing plowing on the contour. So the plowing would actually duplicate contour lines because you're not going up or down. So plowing on the contour prevents soil loss. Reducing plowing reduces soil loss. That's called no-till agriculture. No-till agriculture reduces moisture loss, reduces soil erosion, encourages root growth. So here we've got a extreme example of soil erosion. If the picture was better, we could actually see the different soil profiles, but you can see there used to be soil there. It's been washed away. That's erosion. Here we have conventional farming versus no-till, looking at the root systems of these two. And this is native plains grass. And this is how long the roots are. These are cultivated probably wheat, and you can see how shallow the roots are, as opposed to how deep and well-developed and interlocked these roots are in native prairie vegetation. These crops have been replaced with these crops, and every year they plow these up and plant new ones. So the soil, the topsoil gets disturbed, which means that it can blow away, it can wash away, as opposed to growing crops with healthier root systems. Another diagram, I dig prairie root systems. 15 feet. The scale across the side is feet. So the native prairie vegetation is just outstanding. It's well adapted to the climate. It maintains soil health. Yeah, Kentucky bluegrass with its shallow, embarrassing roots right there, as opposed to lead plant, compass plant, cylindric blazing star. Good job, cylindric blazing star. So no-till agriculture, choosing native plants over introduced plants, both of those can assist in maintaining or increasing soil health. Here's the regions of the world at risk from desertification. That's a lot of the occupied world. I was going to say, this is the Sahara, this is the Amazon, this is the Sahel where people live, this is where people live, this is where every place else is where people live. So middle of Australia, middle of the Sahara, middle of the Amazon, the frozen tundra regions, not a lot of worry of desertification. Really, really dangerous. Not good, not good, not good. Soil profile refers to the vertical organization of soil. There's different horizons, visible, horizontal layers in a profile. There's the O, A, B, and C horizons. I'm not going to test you on the horizons. You should know that there's horizons. They organize themselves as the soils develop over time. The boundaries between them reflect differences in color, texture, structure, moisture, and other soil properties. So this is a pedon. It's the basic soil unit. And then here we've got the organic A, E, B, C, and R regolith horizons. So the O horizon, here we've got an actual cross-section through soil. And this is a pretty typical photograph. The U.S., where the Soil Conservation Service has books that have pictures of different soil profiles that you can look at. So here we've got a mollisol. That's a grassland soil in southeastern South Dakota. We've got the O organic horizon, and then the A horizon in here. We've got the E. The E is illuviated, where material has washed out. It's made of sand and silt and leaching resistant materials, so water percolates through and strips away some of the minerals in the E layer. They accumulate in the B layer, clays, aluminum, iron. The B horizon is often yellowish or reddish because of oxidation, and the deposited materials have oxidized. This is also where sometimes you can develop a layer of carbonate material. The C, made of weathered bedrock, and then the R is regolith. So typical soil profile for a mollisol, like I said, a grassland soil in South Dakota. Soil characteristics. There's a bunch of soil characteristics. Fertility, very important. The ability of soil to grow plants. That's probably the most important characteristic. And first, let's look at some of the different physical properties of soil. So first off, color. The chemical makeup determines the color. Typically reds and yellows from iron oxides, black in prairie soils. The color can be deceptive though. Some tropical soils are very black, but they also have low organic content. So typically dark soils have a lot of nutrients, very rich soils, good for growing, but tropical soils sometimes can also be dark. So color is important. And this is the Munsell color chart. And there's page after page after page of different colors. And so here they've got a chunk of soil and they're comparing it. Looks like it's, I don't know, maybe that one. But you can see that you can, so yeah, here's a key. And then you'd be able to say, well, this is a whatever that exact shade of color is to identify that horizon or that type of soil. Texture refers to the amounts of particles of different sizes. So largest is sand, smaller than sand is silt, smaller than silt is clay. The soil texture triangle shows varying proportions of clay and silt and sand. Loam. Loam is a word for a nice balanced soil. So let's look at the triangle. So this would be all silt. This would be all clay. This would be all sand. Someplace in here would be a mix of clay and sand. Well, here you've got loam. Loam. So less on the clay, and midway between sand and silt would be loam. Not enough clay, not enough nutrients, too much clay. The soil is tough for plants to grow in. Sand, silt. And then these are the descriptive terms. You could have sand, a loamy sand, a sandy loam, a sandy clay loam, a sandy clay, clay, silty clay loam, silt loam, silt, loam, clay loam, loam. So today's word is loam, which is an optimal mix of sand and silt and clay. Structure refers to the size and shape of the lumps in the soil. You can have crumbs, you can have plates, you can have blocks, you can have prisms, you can have columns. There you got your crumbs, got your plates, prisms, blocks. It's just a descriptive term. Consistence is the cohesion or how they stick together. Is it brittle? Porosity is a physical property. It's the number of spaces between the soil particles. The more porous it is, the more easily air, water, and roots are going to flow through the soil. Moisture. Plants grow best when soil is at field capacity, so not too much water, not too little water, just right. Field capacity is going to be holding the maximum water available for plant use after the water has drained from the large pore spaces. So it's not saturated, but the soil is still kind of wet. Chemical properties. So those were for the physical properties. Let's talk about some of the chemical properties. Colloids are tiny particles of clay. I mentioned a minute ago, if there's not enough clay, you could not have enough nutrients. Clay particles, because of their chemical structure, they are outstanding at holding on to chemicals that are good for plant growth. Without them, leaching is when the water would pick up those chemicals that are important and take them away. Water dissolves important chemicals, and the water goes someplace else and takes the chemicals with it. Acidity, alkalinity, the pH of soil is very important. If the soil is too acid or too alkaline, the nutrients could be in the soil, but plants wouldn't be able to actually access them. So, for example, pine trees. Pine trees are naturally acidic, and so if you're in a region that has lots of pine trees for a long time, you'll typically have very acidic soils. Colloids, the little particles, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, aluminum, sodium, different nutrients actually are bind to the clay particle, and then they're available in the soil for plants to use. The root hairs will pick up these different nutrients off of the clay. pH, again, you could have like a peat soil. Would be as acidic as vinegar. You could have an acidic soil, again, with pine trees. Some desert soils could be too basic, too mineral, or too alkali rather. So you'd have to add acid. Over here you'd have to add bases like limestone to make it less acidic so that the nutrients would be available for plants. So enough about soil. Let's talk about energy pathways. So feeding relationships between organisms in an ecosystem make energy pathways. Like I said, usually the energy and matter flows when things get eaten. And those who eats whom, those are trophic relationships. Energy flowing through trophic relationships creates a food chain. Organisms at the same feeding level, so producers or carnivores, are at the same trophic level. Usually, ecosystems have between 3 and 6 levels. They usually begin with a primary producer and end with detritivores that eat dead stuff. So here we've got some sort of food web. We've got producers, we've got diatoms, we've got plants, and then zooplankton and snails are primary consumers. The fish eat the snails, they're secondary consumers. The frog could also eat the snails or other things, making it a secondary consumer. If the fish eats a frog or a small fish, then they're a tertiary. That's the 3rd level. Over here we've got grass as a primary producer. I'm not really sure what the snake is supposed to be eating. If we had like little rodents or insects that the snake eats, then the snake could be a secondary, actually tertiary. It's got to be, so primary consumer would be the rodent. The snake could be a secondary consumer if it eats a rodent. To be a tertiary, it'd have to eat something that ate something that ate something. So in this case, the bird is definitely a tertiary consumer because it's eating the fish. That fish was also a tertiary consumer. If the bird eats the snake that ate a fish, that's a tertiary consumer. Food webs are interrelated food chains, and consumers that eat everything are omnivores. So here we've got an Arctic food web of producers and consumers and consumers and consumers and consumers. And then eventually there'd be decomposers. Producers represent the lowest level. Primary producers or primary consumers feed on producers. So primary consumers are herbivores. A secondary consumer eats primary consumers. Carnivores, they eat meat. A tertiary consumer eats everything or eats the other consumers, unless they're an omnivore. Detritivores and decomposers eat dead stuff. So we've got producers, we've got consumers, we've got primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, we've got omnivores, detritivores, and decomposers. Those are good vocabulary words. You definitely need to know those for the midterm or final exam or whatever's coming up. Detritivores, worms, centipedes, snails, slugs, fungus, bacteria. Energy pyramid. So often these food webs, food chains get displayed as an energy pyramid because the amount of energy moving through the levels decreases. Only 10% of the energy from each level gets passed on to the next. The other 90% is lost as heat. So the most efficient use of resources happens at the lowest level. Applies to humans as well. So here we've got food pyramid. We've got producers making 1,000 calories. We've got consumers making 1,000 calories. We've got consumers making 10 calories. And then finally, only 1 calorie is making it up to the tertiary consumer because at each step, 90% of the energy is lost as heat. So same idea, if you grew wheat and fed it to cows, out of 810 kilograms of wheat, you could maybe get 81 kilograms of beef. That could feed 8 kilograms of people. On the other hand, if you just fed the grain right to people, you could get 81 kilograms of people off of 810 kilograms of wheat. There's another important point to this, and that's called biological amplification. So chemical pesticides get concentrated at the top of the food web. Long-lived, stable, soluble in fatty tissues of consumers, those are the characteristics of the chemicals, the pesticides, and other chemicals that get amplified in food webs. They become increasingly concentrated at each level. DDT is probably the most famous chemical that undergoes biological amplification with disastrous results. Large fish, whales, all of those are examples of polar bears are organisms that have biological amplification of pesticides. Yeah, I'm going to back up for a sec. Right. So if you have, we'll just say, thousands of grasshoppers eating, right, you got a field. We spray the field with pesticides, and it doesn't kill the grasshoppers, but it just messes them up a bit. So now let's just say we've got hundreds of grasshoppers eaten by 10 snakes. So each snake ate 10 grasshoppers, or each snake ate, let's just say 100 grasshoppers. So all of the pesticides that were eaten by the grasshopper are stored in the grasshopper. And then when the grasshopper is eaten by the snake, all of the grasshopper's pesticides are stored in the snake. And then if the snake eats thousands of grasshoppers, all of those pesticides accumulate. And then when all of those snakes get eaten by the hawks, all those pesticides get passed along. So really, it'd be interesting. We should flip the numbers and say, like, each of these is going to have 1 unit of pesticide, 10 units of pesticide, 100 units of pesticide, 1,000 units of pesticide. So it's really better to eat lower on the food chain in terms of energy loss, in terms of pesticide accumulation. Biological amplification. Ooh, let's talk about communities and some words. So communities are populations of plants and animals in a particular place. Habitat is where they live. It fits the needs of the species. There's some habitat for birds. So, evolution and adaptation. Evolution, I'll talk more about in a bit. there's a definition: process in which the first single-celled organisms changed, diversified over time, eventually producing the world's millions of species of organisms. Species, there's a tricky definition. Population of organisms that can reproduce sexually and produce fertile offspring. So if they can't reproduce and make fertile offspring, they're not in the same species. Evolution, the idea of evolution, or rather the idea of natural selection as the mechanism behind evolution, was thought of by Charles Darwin. And he started with a series of statements that are obvious. Like, everything about evolution is testable. Everything about evolution is obvious. So he noticed in any generation of organisms, more organisms are born than will survive. So if you've ever planted seeds, you know that not all the seeds are going to germinate and grow. In a litter of animals, not all of them are going to make it to survive. Not all of them are going to survive to reproduce. So, idea number one, more organisms are born than will survive. They're not all going to make it. Numerous offspring are not identical. If there are inheritable characteristics like height or eye color or hair color or having a longer beak or a shorter beak or a stronger beak, all of those are variations that individuals would express. Like if you ever, like I said, seeds. If you've ever planted seeds, you know that they don't all grow equally well. Some grow really quickly, others don't. Same thing with puppies. Like in each litter of puppies, usually there's at least one that isn't as big. It's the runt. So those are individual variations in a group of organisms. So if those characteristics can be passed along genetically, then they will. Because not all the organisms that are born will survive to reproduce, there's competition for survival. Organisms that are better equipped to survive will survive. Those are the ones that are going to reproduce and pass along their successful genes to their offspring. Over time, as things change, what determines what a successful organism is also changes, and then the organisms change in response to that new pressure. That's it. That's all of evolution. It's all testable. It's all obvious. It's all things that you could observe. Yeah, I just got to say, Darwin was interested in why do we have so many organisms? And this all comes out of the 1800s, and it all comes out of geology. That biologists in the 1800s were suddenly aware of the existence of organisms that used to exist that didn't, and they could see them in fossils and rocks. So if there's organisms that used to be alive, but they're not alive anymore, and at the same time, and maybe even more confusing, there's organisms that are alive now that weren't before, where the heck did those new ones come from? The answer that Charles Darwin and also Wallace, who was working in Indonesia, the answer they came up with was natural selection is the driver of evolution. So yeah, Darwin, it has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with humans being descended from apes. We're relatives. Yeah, if you have questions, please hit me up in Zoom or send me a text. We move on. Again, I'm just going to say the too long, didn't read version is every aspect of evolution is not just testable, it's been tested again and again and again and again. It's all obvious. It's all common sense. It was just a brand new idea at the time, and it was an incredibly important idea. Like, evolution is to biology what plate tectonics is to geology. It's the huge idea that explained a whole lot. So successful organisms, the ones that are good, possess traits or adaptations that enable them to survive. This is what they mean by the survival of the fittest. The ones that are best equipped to pass on their genes do. This is one of the trees of life, starting with Luca, the last universal common ancestor, and then branching off into plants and animals and Let's see, what do we have? Backbones, the vertebrates, everything with a backbone. We got fish. We got cartilaginous fishes, bony fishes. We got reptiles, dinosaurs. They went extinct. We've got mammals over here. And then the pinnacle of human evolution. Well, yeah, we're not really the end. Anyway, evolution, we move on. Niche. Niche is what they do. So habitat is where they live. The niche is the job. What do you do? Well, I eat seeds. That's my niche. Determined by the physical and biological needs of the organism. Different in each habitat. Many species can exist in the same habitat, right? Like you've been outside and you know that there's more than just the one bird, but the niche is the unique role that that species performs within that habitat. So let's talk about the white-breasted nuthatch and the brown creeper. And as an example, those are two species that exist in the same habitat, but they have different niches. The white-breasted nuthatch can actually go up and down the tree, but the brown creeper just goes up. So the white-breasted nuthatch and the brown creeper see different bugs and eat them. The white-breasted nuthatch is going to see the bugs as it goes down the tree. The brown creeper sees the bugs as it goes up the tree, so they don't run into each other. There's no conflict. Everything's copacetic because they're not in the same niche. They're in the same habitat. They might even both be eating bugs, but they're different niches because of the physical characteristics of the organism. They have the white-breasted nuthatch has different feet that allow it to go down the tree. Two different species can't occupy the same niche because one of them is going to be better. That's the idea of competitive exclusion. So, yeah, if we back it up, yeah, if there was another bird that looked like the brown creeper and crawled like the brown creeper, they wouldn't be able to occupy the same area because they would be occupying the same niche. But the white-breasted nuthatch and the brown creeper, because they're physically different, because they eat differently, they occupy different niches in the same habitat. Species interactions. Oh, yeah. So, what are your options for dealing with another species as a species? Well, there's symbiosis, in which at least one of them's getting helped. Nobody's getting hurt. At least one of them's getting helped. Mutualism, they both benefit. Parasitism, one benefits and the other one is harmed. Commensalism, one benefits, the other is relatively ineffective. So symbiosis, commensalism seem pretty similar, as opposed to mutualism, where they both benefit, or parasitism, where one of them's doing well and the other one's getting hosed. Species interactions, mutualism, like lichen, fungus, Fred fungus, and Alice algae living together in symbiosis, where the algae makes food and the fungus gives the algae a home, gives it water. Parasitism, mistletoe is an example of a parasite that is taking nutrients from the tree. Commensalism, the orchid's growing on the tree and the tree doesn't even notice. So the tree doesn't care, whatever. So commensalism would be a type of symbiosis, except only the orchid benefits, the tree doesn't care. Not helped, not hurted, whatever. Abiotic, so non-living influences on the distribution of species. We've got air and soil temperatures, again, Goldilocks principle. So there's like global Goldilocks principles, because when temperatures get too hot, like once you start getting over 120 degrees or so, enzymes start to break down. So there's global hot and cold limits. Like below freezing, it's very difficult for organisms to survive because water is a solid below freezing. Above 120 degrees, it's difficult to deal with enzymes. But then each organism itself would have particular air and soil temperature requirements. Precip, same deal. Too much water, no good. Not enough water, no good. But it totally depends on the organism. You know, there's organisms that live entirely in water. So water quality with regards to pollution or clarity, clear water that would allow sunlight to penetrate deeper for plants. Day length is an abiotic influence. Some places have 12 hours every day. Some places go from 24 hours of light to 24 hours of darkness. And you can put all this together in the life zone concept. This is Humboldt. Alexander Humboldt came up with the idea of life zones, and he was looking mainly at altitudinal zonation of plants and animals. I really hope I have a picture. Oh yeah, latitude acts like elevation. Like as you go up in latitude toward the poles, it gets colder. As you go up in elevation, it gets colder. So high latitude works like high elevation works like high latitude. So here we've got elevational zonation going from tropical rainforest to temperate deciduous forest to needle-leaf forest to tundra to ice and snow. So you could be at sea level in the tropics in Ecuador and go from tropical rainforest to ice and snow at the same latitude. Just like going from the equator to the poles, you're going to go from tropical rainforest to deciduous to needle-leaf to tundra to ice and snow. So altitude or elevation works the same way as latitude works, that high latitude is cold, low latitude is warm, low elevation is warm, high elevation is cold. Limiting factors. Limiting factors, it's the idea that there are abiotic components that would limit an organism. It could be physical, chemical, or biological limits on an organism. For example, nutrient-poor soil would be a limiting factor. Total darkness would be a limiting factor. Lack of water would be a limiting factor. Too little, too much, low temperature, low water, lack of chlorophyll. Some species, like humans, live all over the world. Other species can only live in specific areas, like pandas that eat just bamboo. No bamboo, no pandas. Humans are generalists. We survive everywhere. Rats. So, the coast redwood, you may have seen them. They grow on the coast. In fact, they need coastal fog. That's why they are found only on the coast. In California, as you know now, it doesn't rain in the summer, but redwoods need water year-round. In fact, during the summer, a mature redwood can use 500 gallons of water a day. But if it's not raining, where do they get that? The answer is fog drip. When the fog comes in, it condenses out on their needles. Some of the water is absorbed by the needles. The rest is going to condense out on the needles and fall. In fact, under a single redwood, you can get 18 inches of rain in a year, or just in the summer, underneath a mature redwood in Santa Cruz. So the range of coast redwoods is limited to regions that have summer fog, as opposed to the red maple that exists across pretty much the entire East Coast. Generalist, highly specific requirements. Ecosystem disturbance and succession. So a disturbance is something that disturbs an ecosystem. Windstorms blow down trees, flooding buries and washes things away, wildfires burn everything, volcanic eruptions either burn or cover up with new land, new lava, new rock. So how do ecosystems deal with disturbances? Well, the process of recovering from a disturbance is called succession. When an ecosystem is disturbed enough that most or all of its species are removed, an area undergoes changes in species composition as new communities replace the old. The old communities are gone, they've been removed by the disturbance, and now we see new communities. Wildfire and fire ecology is part of this. Fire is a natural phenomenon. Many ecosystems, California's ecosystems, are fire adapted. Depending on the severity of the fire, different species will be affected differently. In a mild fire, for example, maybe flowers or small plants would get utterly destroyed, but the trees with thick enough bark would be left alone and they would be fine. So depending on the severity of the fire. So, and unfortunately, across the American West, we've done fire suppression. We have been afraid of fire. We didn't understand fire. And so in a forest, we could look at, there's the tree, the crown of the tree, the top part of the tree. There's surface fuel, which is going to be dead stuff, shrubs on the ground. And then in between the surface fuel and the upper branches, it's called ladder fuel. So because we've stopped fires from burning, and because we live in California, where we have chaparral ecosystems that like to burn every 20 years, manzanita and the foothills, all those plants, they really want to burn every 20 years. They go out of their way to make chemicals to help them burn, because that's how they cycle nutrients. If it was wetter, there'd be more fungus. But in the chaparral ecosystem, it's too dry to get good fungal growth to break down the old dead stuff. So fire is how chaparral ecosystems do that. Yellow pine forests also love fire. There's a bunch knob cone pines, for example. The cones don't open until they get heated by a fire. So you have to have a fire that's hot enough to open up the cones in order to get regrowth of knob cone pines. But if you prevent fires or put them out before they can burn the surface fuel, you get this ladder fuel, and you typically get large, the surface, the fire starts at the surface. The ladder fuels transition that fire from the surface up into the crown, and then the whole tree burns. When that happens, the trees are often killed. The soil's going to hit higher temperatures. All the other vegetation is going to get wiped out. However, in California, Native Americans managed the forests, and nature before that managed the forest, and we typically had small, patchy fires because nothing put them out. So the surface fuel, when it built up enough and there was a lightning strike, it would burn. But trees have things, adaptations like self-pruning, where the lower branches just fall off on their own, which is a bummer for the tree on one hand, because then those leaves aren't making energy anymore. On the other hand, there's no more ladder fuel. So self-pruning is an example of an adaptation of fire-resistant trees. So in places where you have little fires, you just get a little fire, it burns the ground, would open the pine cones, and it would also clear the surface fire is going to clear out all the plants, so there's more sunlight hitting the ground for the seeds from the knob cone pines, for example. So other adaptations are fire-resistant bark. A lot of pines, redwoods have bark that doesn't burn easily, so everything on the ground can burn, and the bark will smolder and get black, but the tree won't catch on fire, so the tree comes through intact. The small plants get destroyed, they get burned, but typically if they live in a region with fire, they'll have things like large roots underground that store energy so that when the fire burns through, they can re-sprout and grow. So this is what we've got, and this is the absolute worst. You get big catastrophic fires that kill the trees, as opposed to having small-scale fires that don't hurt the forest and actually make the forest healthier. So this is what the Forest Service and fire managers are working toward across the American West, trying to reproduce the effects of small fires. And then once the small stuff is burned, this fire wouldn't spread because there's nothing around it to burn, because the small fires just burn stuff. So terrestrial refers to the land. Let's look at two types of terrestrial succession after a disturbance. So if everything gets cleared off down to bare rock, let's say a volcano erupts and covers everything with lava. There's no soil, there's no plants, there's nothing. That's primary succession. That's starting from bare rock. It's the beginning stage of an ecosystem. Primary succession is going to start with these things called pioneer communities made up of invasive plants that can establish themselves on bare rock. Lichen, for example, can secrete acids that's going to help break down the rock. If there's soil left over, like let's say there's a small landslide or a small not too bad fire that just burns most of the plants, so you still have soil, that's secondary succession. And obviously things would happen much more quickly with secondary succession because there's still soil, maybe still some plants, maybe still some animals. There's been a disturbance, but everything didn't get wiped out. That's secondary succession. Much more common. So here we've got primary succession taking place on a lava flow in Hawaii. Secondary succession after a fire. So this would be an example of what I was talking about. This tree still looks like a stick, but this bush right over here looks like it's re-sprouting. So I'm just going to hope it's a manzanita and it had a large root ball or burl underground that stored energy. You can see these other shrubs. Looks like they just popped back just fine. So this is secondary succession. Looks like everything's dead. But below ground, the soil is still there, and below ground, some plants are still alive. Some super famous examples, Mount St. Helens, which erupted in 1980, way before all of you were born. Excellent example of primary succession. Everything gets wiped out. Wildfire, wild flowers, fireweed probably, or some sort of paintbrush coming back. So this would be primary succession, except down in here. I mean, well, that's secondary, that's primary. Oh yeah, and then you can see how much more rapidly the areas with secondary succession came back as opposed to the areas with just primary succession. Oh, that was good. I like that. In aquatic succession, it's typically eutrophication. Eu means good. Eutrophic, something about good trophic. Gradual enrichment of water bodies with plant material and organic debris. This is why ponds and lakes get smaller. So starting with open water, all the dead stuff is just going to accumulate sediment on the bottom. And so over time, you're going to go from a pond or a lake to a meadow and then a forest. So this would be aquatic succession as opposed to terrestrial or land-based succession. Stability and biodiversity, as I mentioned, biodiversity is a key factor in stability. Biodiversity is good. The more diverse everything is, the better off everybody is. So stability and resilience. Stability, yeah, it's maybe constantly changing, but not diverging greatly from its original state. So stability is how much change is going on in an ecosystem. If there's very little change, we'd say it's stable. If it's constantly changing, then it's not very stable. As opposed to resilience, and resilience is the ability to recover. So I've put them together, but they're not the same. Stable is how resistant to change it is. Resilience is how easily it springs back from a disturbance. So resilience, lots of diversity. Prairie grasslands remain stable. So it went from grassland to grassland. So this was both stable and resilient. A stable resistant that isn't a stable ecosystem that isn't resilient, like this rainforest. So it's stable, not a lot of change. If there's a big change, what grows back may be completely different. So that would be not resilient. Resilience is its ability to grow back to what it was. Stability is its resistance to change. So this ecosystem was stable but not resilient. This ecosystem was very resilient and relatively stable. Biodiversity. Humans are responsible for the 6th great extinction on our planet. Species are going extinct now at a rate that we haven't seen since the 5th mass extinction on the planet. That one was the impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. So we are doing as good a job on the planet as the comet that wiped out the dinosaurs. Why? Well, habitat loss, like grasslands where the bison used to live and the great wildebeest and whatever live. Well, we like to grow wheat there and rice and things like that. So habitat loss. Sorry, animals. Sorry, plants. This is now farmland. Degradation is when the land is made worse through bad farming practices. And fragmentation is like if you put a road through the rainforest, that rainforest is now split into 2 smaller chunks of land. And a lot of organisms won't cross a road because it acts as a barrier. They get killed when they cross the road. So habitat loss due to conversion from one type of community to another, mainly to agriculture. Fragmentation, putting in roads as well as losing more habitat. Air, water, soil pollution, unsustainable resource use, all of these are putting pressure on the natural world. Human-induced climate change, human-introduced invasive species. Invasive species are a huge problem, and I will talk more about invasive species with some examples. So here we've got biodiversity, and you can just look at raw numbers of species, and you can see it's pretty close to the map of net primary productivity, with the highest values being found in the tropical rainforests. Half of all the different species on the planet live in the Amazon. Water, obviously a limiting factor. Water, a limiting factor. Temperature, a limiting factor. Temperature, a limiting factor. Amphibians are especially vulnerable to disturbances. For example, there's a mass extinction going on among frogs because of a fungus that affects their skin in the tropics. Returning predators can make it difficult to recover. So, yeah, lots of places have threatened species, mainly in the tropics. When the number of organisms at a trophic level changes in response to the number of organisms at another trophic level, we call that a trophic cascade. So that's when the number of organisms at one level changes the number of organisms at another level. And the best example of this that I can think of is the trophic cascades in Yellowstone. So wolves were excluded from Yellowstone from 1926 to 1995. So what happened was coyotes, you might have heard nature abhors a vacuum. Nature does not like vacuums. So there were wolves that were eating animals. With the wolves removed from Yellowstone, coyotes, which are smaller, increased, ate small mammals, which reduced food for foxes, badgers, birds of prey. So that would reduce the diversity. Because there weren't wolves, the elk were overpopulating the park, and they were eating the trees that shade the rivers that keep them cool so you can get good fish like trout in the rivers. Also, because you didn't have the willows and the shrubs on the banks of the river to stabilize it, you had more erosion. You had a reduction in the diversity of habitats like pools, and then ripples and rapids and pools would be more diverse. So the stream habitats became less diverse, so the fish and the birds that use those habitats became less diverse. The coyotes took over. The foxes, badgers, birds of prey, there were fewer of them. The aspens were eaten by elk, so the aspens were starting to die out. And then somebody wondered, hey, what would happen if we brought some wolves back? And they did. And the wolves ate the coyotes and chased a lot of the coyotes out of the park, which allowed pronghorn antelope to show up. Because there were more wolves, there were fewer elk, so there was more aspen. The elk population is half of its previous size. And I was going to say there's a video that I've put in the playlist for this chapter. In fact, I found two. There's a shorter and a longer Yellowstone video. I didn't know how excited you'd be about trophic cascades in Yellowstone. But with the coyote gone and the wolves there were fewer elk, so there were more grizzly bears. There were more bison because there were fewer elk. So elk and bison probably competing for something. So now we have fewer elk, more bison, more bears. Beavers showed up, which created ponds, which increased the diversity of habitat for fish, amphibians, insects, birds, and small mammals. The streamside vegetation has come back because the wolves aren't, the wolves were not eating the streamside vegetation. The elk were eating the streamside vegetation. So the banks are more stable. There's less erosion, which probably helps the trout spawn. Because the wolves don't bury their kills like the coyotes did, there's more food for scavengers like golden eagles, ravens, magpies, and bears. So they brought back the killers, and everything is better. Nature is more balanced. It's just better. Trophic cascades. So because they brought in this top-level carnivore, the wolves, the coyotes were bounced out of the top-level carnivore, and the primary consumers, the elk, became fewer, pronghorns increased, and the bison also increased. So you can see how a change at the top level then affected the primary consumers of pronghorn and bison and elk. Trophic cascades. And that's it for this chapter. I hope you enjoyed chapter 13 on ecosystems and soil.